And welcome to our digital discussion this evening. My name is John Harry with the Milwaukee County Historical Society. We are really looking forward to tonight's collaborative presentation, with our friends way up north in Door County at the Ephraim Historical Foundation, Ephraim Milwaukee's Door County Connection. So we've got our archivist, Steve Schaffer, and their curator, Cody Schreck, talking about how the two places relate and have interconnected over the years. Before we launch into that, I also want to let you know what's going on next week with the Milwaukee County Historical Society as far as virtual programming goes. So this is next week's Thursday Talk, the Antiques Virtual Show with Hindman Auctions. So they've picked some things from our collection that they are going to talk about and assign value, just like that one show that is on that one TV station that you might see sometimes. So hope you can join us for Antiques Virtual Show a week from today with Hindman Auctions. We're happy to have them with us. And even though the exhibit's not up anymore, the beer still exists with Indeed Brewing Company in Walker's Point on South 2nd Street. It's the Lady Elgin Foreign Extra Stout. I stopped in over the weekend just to make sure that they indeed still had some, and they do. They have a little bit left if you're still looking to get that beer that we made with them. $1 from every pint, crowler, or growler goes to the Milwaukee County Historical Society. So make sure you get out while you still can with that. But tonight we're going to dream of vacation land and the history between where we go to do that sometimes and how that relates to here to lead us on our journey northward tonight is Steve Schaffer, the assistant archivist at the Milwaukee County Historical Society, and Cody Schreck, who is the curator at the Ephraim Historical Foundation. Cody also, you might look familiar. He gave a presentation. He used to work for us. He gave a presentation for us about the time machine taking us through the years at the beginning of the year, and then he left us for a place that is fine. So we'll reconvene at the end for a question and answer session. So if you have any questions, please put those in the comments. But without any further ado, Ephraim Milwaukee's Door County Connection with Steve Schaffer and Cody Schreck. Gentlemen, it's all you.
Thanks, John. So I'm the first Ephraim Door County Connection we'll talk about tonight. Or Milwaukee Door County Connection, I should say. But yeah, I'm Cody Schreck. I'm from the Ephraim Historical Foundation. Steve has been introduced. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself again.
Sure. I'm Steve Schaffer, the assistant archivist at the Milwaukee County Historical Society.
Nice. Good to see you, Steve.
Yeah, it's been a while, buddy.
It has been a while. Whoops, jumped ahead. So yeah, this is what we're looking at tonight. The things that connect a small village in northeastern Wisconsin with the state's largest city. So for those who might need a map of where Ephraim is comparatively to Milwaukee, we're all the way up there on that little red dot, almost to the UP, not quite, but we're up there. So really, it seems weird, like what could possibly connect these two places that seem so different? Yes, we're both on the water, but Ephraim watches the sun set over the lake. Milwaukee watches it rise. Ephraim's a very small little village. Milwaukee is this big metropolitan city. So at face value, they don't seem like to be places that have a lot in common or even have a shared history for that matter. But the reality is they do have a pretty deep connection to each other. So me and Steve, we're gonna take a look at, what connects the villages or what connects the village and the city, how those connections have evolved over time, and really how we're still connected today. So, Steve, I think I'll let you lead off with kind of where this connection starts, and that's with immigrants from Europe.
Sure. You bet. So, the immigrant population is one very big connection that Milwaukee has with Ephraim. This is a shot of the Leif Erikson statue in Juneau Park. Many of you have probably seen that. It's really emblematic because of the foundation of the Milwaukee Scandinavian settlement was laid down in part by the Viking descendants of Lucky Leif, who were attracted to this locale by the city's maritime activity on the Great Lakes. The reasons for the immigration were the same reasons that a lot of immigrant groups shared. Religious reform was one. There was a desire for more freedom in form and content than was allowed by the rather strict Lutheran state church. Lazare, or lay reader movement in Sweden, which along with the Haugian movement in Norway, were both attempts to somewhat democratize, I guess, for lack of a better word, the religious experience, where there was less emphasis on a minister and more of a participation with lay people. And then, of course, there were always the dissenting sects outside of the official Lutheran Church: Methodists, Quakers, Moravians, which Cody's going to talk about in a little bit. And there were economic factors as well. So there were comparatively low wages in all the Scandinavian countries compared to the United States. There was an undue influence of money lenders, which crippled a lot of people economically. And there was a desire by second and third sons to avoid the debilitating effects of primogeniture, or the first son gets everything, and that was the reason for the Vikings, of course, too. The Scandinavians had a really good system of communication with the old country. They had what were known as the America Brevet, or the American letters, and these were sent back to the old world by the thousands, and provided detailed accounts of conditions and opportunities in the new world. And the brevets themselves have been described as the most potent single factor behind Scandinavian immigration at this time. The picture obviously is depicting ship carpenters, which coincidentally a lot of the Scandinavian immigrants to Milwaukee were. So this is an example of one of our documents that we have at the Historical Society. We have all of the naturalization records, both declarations of intent and the full naturalizations of early immigrants, even going back to territorial times. And this is as you can see, a territory of Wisconsin, Milwaukee County declaration of intent from Reverend Gustav Junius, who was one of the Swedish immigrants who came to the New World for a more religious freedom. He came here in 1841 and filed his papers in Milwaukee, and started the Pine Lake settlement called New Uppsala. And at this time, Pine Lake was part of Milwaukee County. So this is one of our early examples. These are two other individuals who were prominent. Soren Bakke was a prominent member of the pioneer Norwegian settlement at Muskego. Again, at that time, in territorial times, that was part of Milwaukee County. He declared in Milwaukee, and this would have been done at the courthouse, the federal courthouse in Juneau town. He declared in 1847, right before statehood. And the other gentleman, George Peter Lindeman, he was a clothing merchant, kind of an unusual job for a Scandinavian immigrant, but he was a leading figure in the Swedish community and was also very politically involved. He served as a parade marshal for these torchlight campaigns of the Scandinavian Republican Party, which were in support of, the Scandinavian Republican Club, which was very supportive of Abraham Lincoln's presidential candidacy. This is an old lithograph. This is a Norwegian ship carpenter, Johannes Reinertsen, who was a carpenter, but then made enough money in that trade to be able to open up an inn. So this was a stop-off point for Scandinavian sailors, as well as farmers from the interior settlements. This was in the 5th Ward, Walker's Point, and it stood on what was Clinton Street until the 1890s. The 5th Ward itself was kind of a Scandinavian hub because of George Walker's problems with conflicting land settlements. They weren't resolved till the other two founders, Solomon Juneau and Byron Kilbourne, had kind of got a foot up on them. But by 1843, they were cleared up, and coincidentally, a lot of the Scandinavian immigrants at that time started to come into money, and so they began to buy plots in Walker's Point, and these served them well because of their close proximity to maritime interests such as shipbuilding and docks and things like that. And the 5th Ward was also the terminus for a lot of the plank roads that came from the southwest. So Muskego and rural Scandinavians and farm regions came there too. So it was really a central point for Scandinavians. And I think I'm throwing it back to you, Cody.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting that, you get all these Scandinavian immigrants that come to Milwaukee, obviously, because Milwaukee is kind of this hub for immigration to the rest of Wisconsin. And you see the individuals you mentioned, some stayed in Milwaukee, some kind of went a little further out. It does seem like we had talked about before, a lot of Scandinavian immigrants seem to not like the city much. They seem to want to go to rural areas. Right. And it's interesting because the story of Ephraim starts with a group of Scandinavian immigrants in Milwaukee who don't want to be in Milwaukee anymore. They want to leave. And really that story centers around this one figure. His name's Andrew Iverson. So Andrew Iverson was a Norwegian immigrant. He was a Moravian. So he was a minister for the Moravian Church, or I said a missionary rather, of the Moravian Church. And Moravians, as Steve has alluded to a little bit, were a sect of Protestantism, somewhat similar to Lutherans, but of course different. It is believed to be one of the oldest, if not the oldest, Protestant belief systems in existence. And at this time in the 1840s, when you're having these Scandinavian immigrants come to places like Milwaukee, the Moravians were very heavily focused on things like communal living, so starting like communes, and also missionary activity. And what they were doing around this time was sending missionaries to follow settlers and then create congregations amongst them. So this is what Iverson's role was. Iverson was sent as a missionary to Milwaukee to start a congregation, and that's what he did. He came to Wisconsin in 1849, and he formed a congregation amongst Scandinavian settlers in Milwaukee. But as I mentioned, they didn't like the city. They kind of disliked the city for various reasons, one of which was the conditions of the city, which I guess is overall the issue they had, along with the desire to own land. There was a pretty significant cholera outbreak in the summer of 1850 in Milwaukee. You had a few of those in that early Milwaukee period before kind of modern waterworks systems. So that was certainly a factor, is the cleanliness of the city. The other we have, because luckily Iverson actually took pretty good notes of his work in Wisconsin. And in his brief accounts, he does give a pretty good, he accounts, why the settlers wanted to leave. And amongst the things, he says things like the city life was connected with dangerous temptations. He felt that a lot of the congregation members in Milwaukee were being cheated out of their wages. He said that a lot of those individuals also, were just without work. They were in the city and they couldn't find work. And it's also interesting because Steve mentioned, a lot had come to work on the Great Lakes shipping. Iverson says the congregation members, even the ones who were sailors, desired much more to live in the country than to sail the lakes. So what they decided to do was they decided to leave. And really the catalyst that helped them leave was another Norwegian immigrant by the name of Otto Tank. He was very wealthy. He came from a very wealthy family in Norway. And Tank offered this route for the Milwaukee Moravians to leave with Iverson because he offered to buy them land. So he bought land in what is now what is now Green Bay, essentially in the Fox Valley, and 42 congregation members, men, women, children, Iverson and Tank, went and settled on this land in Green Bay and called it Ephraim. And you might be wondering, I thought Ephraim was in Door County. Why are we talking about Green Bay? Well, they first actually settled in the Green Bay area and named their settlement Ephraim. And it means doubly fruitful. They felt that this was going to be their route to land ownership. This is what they were looking for. But quickly, it was established that Iverson and some of the congregation's members felt that Tank was planning on not fulfilling his end of the deal, that they felt that Tank wanted to kind of establish this feudal system in the Fox Valley, and that none of these congregation members were actually ever going to be able to own land like they wanted to. So as quick as the Fox Valley Ephraim was established, it began to dissolve. And the congregation split. Those who followed Iverson decided to look elsewhere. And one of the places that Iverson had connections to was up here in Door County. He knew of an individual named Ole Larson, another Scandinavian immigrant who was living here on this island, which was called Horseshoe Island. It's now called Eagle Island. It's right out from the mainland of Ephraim. Ole Larson was living on this island at the time, just kind of selling lumber to passing ships, fishing, living alone on this island. He invited Iverson and a few of the congregation members to come up and take a look. So in 1853, Iverson and a few individuals actually walked across the ice from Green Bay to Horseshoe Island. And when they got there, they stayed at Ole's cabin. Next morning, they woke up, walked across the bay, probably like a mile or two to the mainland. And Iverson decided, you know what, this is the place. This is going to be Ephraim, right? So this is when Ephraim, the one that we know now, is established. Iverson purchased, it was about 425 acres for $478. And what they did is they actually lived in shanties on the island next to Ole Larson for the beginning parts of the establishment, as they were clearing trees off the shoreline on the mainland and building homes. And eventually, Ephraim became, this small coastal village. And this is really when Great Lakes shipping is starting to explode. Ephraim is becoming this, when I say isolated, I mean isolated. There was no post office or store within like 75 miles. It took about a week to walk the shoreline to get to Green Bay. But this painting was painted by Iverson. If you look in the bottom middle part, you can see a gentleman in a black coat. It's believed that that's Iverson painting himself painting. So this is, that bluff obviously still there. That's Horseshoe Island in the background, and that's their Moravian church. So this small little village was established. Scandinavian immigrants had come to Milwaukee, and they decided to leave Milwaukee behind for this isolated place with the desire for land ownership. And really, like I said, this is when Great Lakes shipping is about to explode. So I will let Steve talk a little bit about the Great Lakes trade.
Just a quick question. Is that church still there in some form? The Moravian church?
That's a great question. A fantastic question. So the Moravian church is still around. It's not in that spot anymore. It was put on rollers and moved up the hill. There's some debate as to why that was the case. The most logical, I think, is probably protection from the encroaching water. Even in Milwaukee, the lake levels ebb and flow. And, it could have been that this was built at a low level time and they wanted to prevent, high lake level year from destroying their church that they worked so hard to build. So yes, the church is still around. It's had additions to it, but it's up on the hill now. But it is one of the main features of the skyline here in Ephraim.
Great. Good to know. All right. Yeah, as Cody was saying, Great Lake shipping was really kicking off. A lot of people don't really think about the impact that Great Lakes had for transportation and commerce, but Milwaukee benefited greatly from its location on the lake, and some things some factors that allowed it to take advantage of that trade. So this is an 1860 view of Milwaukee's bustling harbor. And its initial rise was because of its location on Lake Michigan and because of the straight cut, which is shown in this slide. The straight cut in 1857 basically, let me see if I can point to it, cut an opening in a peninsula and gave a direct entry. I'm sorry, a direct entry into it's a direct entry into the confluence of the Milwaukee, the Menominee, and the Kinnickinnick River. It was a shortcut from the old long trip around the peninsula, and with the dredging and the cut itself, it made a new channel, and that channel made possible the full utilization of the harbor, the inner harbor, as a an extension of the harbor. So the inner harbor being the rivers. Now we saw that picture of the map with Green Bay. Green Bay actually has a better natural harbor, but Milwaukee's was much more better equipped for the losing the word, the collection and processing of raw materials and shipping out of raw materials than Green Bay. You want to hit the next one, Cody, please. This is a shot that's coming up of, yes. So this is Milwaukee's first real, I would say, industry, and that is grain and specifically wheat exporting. It wasn't beer, it wasn't machinery. Wheat shipments doubled from 250 million bushels to 470 million bushels in 1859, and saw a peak year in 1873 when it topped out just under 25 million bushels. And I believe Milwaukee at one time was the world's largest exporter of wheat. And that was because we were able to utilize the connection with the hinterland to get grain out onto the Great Lakes network. So in the 1850s, rather than smokestacks, you would have seen mills like this. And can you hit the next one there, Cody? So another significant industries that affected the Great Lakes shipping was financing, railroads, and then meat packing. So on the left, we have the Mitchell Building, built by Alexander Mitchell. He was Scottish, but he was connected to seafaring as well. He was a cabin boy, turned millionaire, made his money on financing and railroads. And on the right, we see the Milwaukee and St. Paul Railroad stockyards in the Menominee Valley. And that meat packing became a very large industry in Milwaukee. We don't often think about it, but it was. So there was some big names that we recognize: John Plankinton, Frederick Layton, and among others. And in 1863, Milwaukee was the largest, or the fourth largest operation, and that extended well into the 1870s. So the next shot we have is kind of a byproduct of the meatpacking industry, which is the tannery industry. Meatpacking and the availability of hemlock bark attracted entrepreneurs like Guido Pfister, August Galloon, Albert Trostel, and in 1872, Milwaukee was the largest tannery center in the world, which is really amazing to think about. So the next one, and of course, beer. Beer was a huge industry and getting big at this time. Philip Best's brewery, which was managed by Captain Frederick Pabst, the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company, which is operated by the Ephraim family, and things that affected that industry were things like the Chicago Fire, which pretty much killed their industry. So beer was huge, and then of course we get into the various machine industries. On the left, we have the Bayview Iron Works. It's a shot of the blast furnace, and Reliance Works, which was Edward Alice's plant in Walker's Point. That is Alice Chalmers, which were really coming into their own, given the fact that Edward Alice did receive the contract for the Milwaukee waterworks system, which included making water pipes and huge motors. So Milwaukee was really a pumping industrial juggernaut, just really hitting its stride in the in the late 19th century. And how that affected Ephraim and the Great Lakes was, again, a Scandinavian connection. If you could hit the next one, Cody. So this represents ships. So in the 1850s, skilled Norwegian carpenters were part of the shipbuilding industry in Milwaukee and helped to facilitate the city's commercial rise. This is a list of ships that were built. All of these were two-masted schooners, and they all came out of Milwaukee. And you can see some of them even have kind of Nordic names: Norway, Odin. Most of the 129 seamen residing in Milwaukee in 1850, of that 129, 34 were Scandinavian, which represented 26% of the maritime population in the city, when the total population of Scandinavians in Milwaukee was 1%. Most of the Norwegian sailors came from one community in Norway. It was Farsund at the southern tip. Now, this is another very successful Norwegian, John Thorson. He went to sea at the age of 14 and made his living in Milwaukee from 1843 onward. He started off in ship chandlery, which is the outfitting of ships. But he was most successful as a captain and owner, and diversified into lumber, which took him in the area around Green Bay as well as into Manistee, Michigan. Can you hit the next one, please? And then this is another very important family. It was the largest Scandinavian seafaring family in Milwaukee. Edward Saveland, who's shown here, Captain Edward Saveland, was one of 6 sons of Tones Saveland, all of whom captained their own ships. The daughters were married into other maritime families, and kind of making the Savelands a dynasty in Milwaukee as far as maritime history goes. And can you hit the next one, please? And this is Andrew Joyce. He was a majority shareholder in the Milwaukee Shipyard Company, which was rather significant because it was the first. As I say, it's a Norwegian presence that was taken from the ship deck to the corporate office. His name still lives on in Milwaukee industry and commerce. Lackey and Joyce. He is that Joyce half of that company. So all of these taken together show, a real Scandinavian connection to the Great Lakes and to the area, along the coast of Wisconsin. All of these individuals would have plied their routes along the western shore of Lake Michigan, along Wisconsin, up to Green Bay and to Ephraim. It was more of a commercial connection at this time, not as much of a recreational one. I think that came later with the development of wealth, but this was the time that was building that wealth, shall we say. And I think it's over to you.
Yes, it is. Yes. So I think you're right on that. I think the connection here really at this time is commercial. And when I left off talking last time, Ephraim was an isolated village that, railroads still to this day only get up to Sturgeon Bay. They don't get up this far. And at the time when Ephraim was founded, there was certainly Native American trails present, but those were foot trails. There was no kind of commercial trails that got anything up here. So Ephraim needed to rely on maritime trade. And at this time, as you just talked about, Milwaukee is becoming this juggernaut of Great Lakes trade. And Ephraim needed to tap into that. It needed maritime trade. So what happened was Iverson actually invited this individual here, Aslog Anderson, and his brother Halvor to come build a dock at Ephraim. So the Anderson brothers came up to Ephraim. They were originally from Norway. Incidentally enough, had spent their first few years in Milwaukee, but like others had left. Now, they weren't part of that first Ephraim group, but they were Scandinavian immigrants, came to Milwaukee first, ended up in Ephraim. Even I think Aslog proposed to his wife in Milwaukee at some point. But in 1860 is when he built the dock here in Ephraim. He had spent some years in Escanaba in the lumber industry, so he had some experience. But when he built this dock, he also built a store. So what happened was Ephraim became part of this node of the Great Lakes shipping network because Anderson was able to build this dock. Ships could now dock comfortably in Ephraim, and Anderson had built a warehouse on this dock and a store. So at the warehouse, Ephraimites could store things like cordwood, cedar posts, tan bark, telegraph poles, resources you'd expect to come from a place surrounded by trees. Steve mentioned Milwaukee relied a lot on resources from the hinterland. In this case, the hinterland in Ephraim, Ephraim was exporting lumbered goods, and Anderson dealt mainly, obviously, in lumbered goods, and he did a lot of business with places all over the Midwest, a lot of which were in Milwaukee too. And this gives you a good look at both so on the left, you have the Anderson store and the dock with the warehouse on it. And then on the right, you have the interior of the store. So this is, Andersonville, Ephraim, right? No, it's interesting because if you come to Ephraim, if you've ever been to Ephraim, both of these views are almost identical to today. I could walk across the street from where I'm sitting and see these same views because all of this still exists. The warehouse has been rebuilt it looks the same, but the warehouse is still there. The store is still there. The interior of the store is still historic because the EHF owns and operates it. It's something you can come visit, but it's still something you can see, which I think is incredibly unique. But this was the commercial hub of Ephraim because of the dock. Ephraimites could store their raw goods on that dock there, and then people could come, they could sell it, and they would get things shipped in. And Anderson himself, like I mentioned before, dealt a lot with Milwaukee businesses. And this is from our collection. These are all scans of business invoices from our collection from the 1870s from Anderson. And those of you from Milwaukee, or those of you that listened attentively to Steve a few minutes ago, will recognize these names. Anderson was doing business with, Bradley and Metcalf, Leather Goods, Leighton and Company, Plankinton, Butchers, Roundy's Grocers, the Gall and Frank Company, even, like watches and diamonds from Milwaukee. So these are all things that were being purchased by Anderson to be sold in his store. And really what I think is incredibly interesting is that with Ephraim exporting things like tan bark at this time, and also, importing things like leather shoes, it's not inconceivable to think that in the 1870s, tan bark from trees in Ephraim could have been sold in Milwaukee and returned a few years later in the form of shoes, which is kind of this really interesting cyclical operation of resources it's very plausible. And that was really Great Lakes trade at the time. You had these hub cities like Milwaukee that could manufacture and export finished goods, and places like Ephraim that could export the raw resources like cordwood and also kind of sell those manufactured goods from Milwaukee to the people living here. And as Steve kind of alluded to, this relationship between Ephraim and Milwaukee is very commercial at this time. But that would change. The connection would stay, but it would evolve into something more, like leisure. It was leisure. It was tourism that would come. But right now, it was commercial. See, oops, wrong slide. There we go. And I'll kick it back to Steve for the rise of money and leisure.
Okay, that was really interesting. Actually, I love those, the old receipts and everything, especially from, big players like Gall and Frank. And it's interesting to see the Roundy name, which are still Milwaukee names. Those are really fascinating. So yeah, the emergence of wealthy families in Milwaukee was, obviously a byproduct of everything that had been going on previous to that. The picture I've included is a shot of the Pabst Whitefish Bay Resort. Unfortunately, we don't have any photographs in the early 20th century of family excursions to Ephraim. But no doubt the region brought individuals of means to the area for both business and I think pleasure, because that's probably how, in my mind, it would have started. I have business up in Ephraim, in Green Bay, Sturgeon Bay. Why don't you come with, and we can spend some time there? I would imagine that's quite a logical way to look at it. And still at that time, it would have been, as Cody was saying, mainly by ship, with the exception of the drop in, the stop at Sturgeon Bay. I'm not sure when roads became more available up there, but as networks of transportation other than the maritime industry became available, I think there were a lot of Milwaukee families that would have, and there were a lot of, I could tick off a few of the names. I mean, the Burnhams, George Burnham, the Milwaukee Cream City Brickman, any number of industrialists, Fall, Carnischwager, and not only those individuals themselves, but the corporate or the business class that worked for them, primarily in the office, lawyers. I don't think that there was really kind of a blue collar tourist industry in Ephraim at this time, but it would have been people who had been able to acquire some wealth from Milwaukee's boom. So again, the Plankinton family, the Mitchell family, and those associated with them, the Vogels, Pfisters, Galloons. I mean, I could just go on and on, but I think that's when we begin to see photographs really of Door County as we know it is in our collection is much later into the actually really the post World War II era. I looked through our postcard collection and we didn't have any from Ephraim, only a few from Fish Creek, and they were after World War II. And I know there was an excursion boat that was owned by the Schlitz Brewing Company. The Atlantic was the name of the vessel. It had a very long history in both the Great Lakes and in World War II, but then returned in the 50s. And that ship would sail around to the Great Lakes stops, and Ephraim and Door County were definitely one of them, and then they would go up to the Canadian side of Lake Superior. So our collection is much later. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of images to share other than just some discussion of those collections. Back to you, Cody.
Yeah, I think that's a good point you made, is that I think even the reason you don't have a ton of those early images in your collection is because, that middle class, working class tourism industry didn't kick off till later. This turn of the century when, you have industrialists accumulating wealth and there's more time for leisure, and you have the people that work for them who make a considerable amount of money who also have time for leisure. That's the time that Ephraim grew as a tourism spot, because the increased use of, steam passenger ships. And with, the rise of steam passenger ships, and also you have this dock that has been built in Ephraim, which can accommodate deep water vessels. You have places like, or businesses, I should say, like the Goodrich lines and the Hart lines that are now making Ephraim one of their stops. Ephraim became, a really notable spot or stop on the Goodrich line from Chicago to St. Ignace. And that's the same line, that's the same line and the SS Christopher Columbus in the early part of the century. And at the time, you can see on this map that, obviously the Goodrich lines had their hub in Chicago. They made a stop in Milwaukee before going up to Sturgeon Bay and through the bay and up the harbor. And you can see Ephraim is a stop there. So Ephraim was a tourist destination for the families that could afford it, really. And I think I want to say, let me check my notes, $40 for a round trip ticket on this route from Chicago. So that's about $630 today. So it's, not terribly expensive, but it is important to note that this is a 1930 price, and 1930 is really when the Goodrich Line was starting to fail. This was the Depression, and the Goodrich Lines actually go under during the Depression. But nonetheless, Ephraim becomes a notable spot because it offered really world-class amenities, or I should say high-quality accommodations at affordable prices. And this is an early shot of the Ephraim skyline. You can see obviously the churches, and the Moravian church I was mentioning before is on the top right in this image. But there's also hotels in this image, kind of unassuming hotels that, you had families on the Goodrich Lines who'd come up and stay for a little bit. You had some families that stayed the whole summer at these places off the Goodrich Lines. You had wealthy families that had enough money to, buy their own property in Door County around Ephraim. And the wealthiest families, people like the E-Lines, the Falks, they didn't need the Goodrich Lines. They had their own ships. They had their own yachts that could take them up here. On the left, you see the Seaforth, which is a yacht that was owned by Herman Falk. Herman Falk from Milwaukee, obviously a big industrialist, is very well known to have, spent a lot of time in Ephraim in the summers. And then on the right, you have actually one that you mentioned, Steve, that I didn't think you were going to mention, which is great. That's the Atlantic on the right, owned by Irwin E-Line of the Schlitz Brewery. So the E-Lines were also known to have frequented Ephraim. And, in some cases, they used Ephraim as kind of a harbor from storms when they were making their way across the lakes. I had mentioned Horseshoe or Eagle Island earlier as the place where the settlers first made their jumping off point before Ephraim. That's actually got a very well-positioned harbor that protects ships in storms. And at this time, there was a relatively wealthy family living on the island by the name of the Fuldas. And the Fuldas were known to have allowed yachts to harbor in their small little harbor on the island and even come ashore and stay during the storm. So there are accounts of the Fuldas allowing, the E-Lines to stay when, a storm was bad and they needed somewhere to stay. So it's interesting. And then we talked about, the connection between the two used to be commercial, and now it kind of has turned to more of this tourist leisure. And that's really, where we still are today. That's the connection. Ephraim, if you come up here, if you lived up here the whole year, you'd realize that it has become a very seasonal city. It relies heavily, village. It relies heavily on tourism. It didn't used to be that way, but now tourism is really the main thing. And, Milwaukeeans they're close by now. What used to be this really long trip that the settlers made, whether it be by boat or whether it be walking across the ice, now it's a 3-hour drive. So our connection has become even closer because someone from Milwaukee can get here in 3 hours. And we offer the amenities that people are often looking for. There's a state park nearby. We have hotels. It's a vacation close by. So our connection continues to grow. If you're in Milwaukee and you find yourself in Ephraim, realize that you're part of that continued connection. And I think that's all I wanted to say. I don't know, Steve, was there anything you wanted to close out the connection with before we might take questions?
Well, I'm glad that you brought up the Goodrich lines. That was although they operated out of Chicago, it was a huge docking area along the Milwaukee River. So it would have been the area, if you're familiar with the city, from Clybourne south almost to the Menominee. They were just a phenomenal number of wharfs, and the Christopher Columbus did go out of those. I also wonder too, just I don't know if there's any way to differentiate it, but I'm sure there must have been a huge Chicago connection with Ephraim. I know that Door County has that now with an Illinois connection, and this is about Milwaukee, but if Milwaukee had very many heavy hitting industrialists and wealthy people, Chicago certainly had too. So I imagine that's for another story. But yeah, and I have to tell you, I should really just send you some of the pictures we have from this Aurora. The Atlantic book. It was a scrapbook that two young sailors put together. They were like 18-year-olds at Bayview High School, and the one guy was going to go into Korea. So that summer, they worked on that yacht for. There was a German captain and engineer, and there were people above them, but they did a lot of the heavy work, and they took many photographs. And I know they have some of Ephraim, and I'll definitely I'll have to share those with you, and we'll kind of see. Maybe we can do something with that. But no, that's all I have to say. That was really very interesting.
Yeah, I'll have to share those invoices with Milwaukee companies from the Anderson collection with you, because there is boxes full of those, and they're all unique in industry. I showed you. I think I showed you the one of the roofers who had an office in the Newhall House, which, of course, those who know the ill-fated Newhall House that became one of the worst hotel fires in the Midwest. But yeah, that's again for a separate story. But I think we should probably let John jump in and take care of questions here.
Yeah, guys. Well, that's so interesting. It also makes me it's really sad that it's taken so dang long for things to warm up, because it's like, all right, I'm ready for get out of town for a little bit. So right now is your chance to ask any questions. So put those in the comments. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, we see them, and Steve or Cody would be happy to ask them. So we hear a lot about. I think German culture dominates Milwaukee's history in the zeitgeist, and as far as what is popularly known. And so it's interesting to hear about another European ethnic group and their role in Milwaukee's past, and also why they left and went somewhere else. Maybe both of you can kind of chime in as well. German culture was a lot about we're going to come together and have Gemütlichkeit and all that stuff. Is there something about Scandinavian culture that's similar as far as gathering? Or moving together as a group, or celebrating different things?
I'll say two things related to that. First of all, I think the equivalent for, in this case, you talk about the Gemütlichkeit for Germans. For Ephraim, it was the Moravian aspect of it, and maybe not the Scandinavian aspect, but it was that communal idea of Moravianism that it was, I believe, the United Brotherhood is kind of how they refer to themselves, is they are kind of connected in a communal way. It's not very isolated. But also it's interesting because we talk about Milwaukee, it's German dominated, and it's interesting to see these Scandinavians make a presence. It's flipped in Ephraim. Scandinavians are the primary ethnic group that's talked about. But what's lesser talked about is the German settlement up the hill. There were just certainly Germans up here, but they're not generally talked about in the mainstream like the Scandinavians are. So it's interesting to see that juxtaposition.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
No, I think the most interesting thing that I found out while doing this research was just the disproportionate amount that people of Scandinavian descent played in the maritime trade. And there was a point I wanted to follow up that Cody had made about Iverson claiming that Scandinavians or Norwegians had been treated fairly. Two Norwegian carpenters took their employer to court for back wages that were owed to them, and that had never been done before. And they won their case, and this company was forced to pay, which I thought was just amazing. I don't really know much about them as a ethnic group and their collectiveness, but they certainly seem to have a real ethic for hard work and fair play. It seems like, and I saw that very much in that court case. The other thing too that I can't believe we haven't done with this city in Norway, Farsund, there has to be some kind of Milwaukee Farsund connection, given the fact that so many of those Norwegian sailors stayed here, and I mean they were seasonal; they'd be around the lake. But when the sailing time was over, and that did close during the winter months, they were here. So I mean, that's something I've got to pursue. I didn't really know much about Scandinavians in Milwaukee until I did this, and it was pretty interesting to learn about it.
Yeah.
We had talked about a little before, Cody. So Milwaukee is known as Brew City, and Ephraim is one of the driest cities that Wisconsin's ever had. Is that right?
Yeah. So Ephraim. Yeah, that's certainly. I mean,
I don't know how to
Ephraimites know
broach
this.
that subject.
No, you're good. No, this is certainly something obviously Ephraimites know, and something that is obviously of interest to those who don't know in Milwaukee. Because Milwaukee its culture is alcohol. Ephraim was the longest standing dry municipality in the state until 2016. So it was just in 2016 that the village allowed for the drinking or for the sale of alcohol, I should say. And still it is just wine, or it's just wine and beer. That's not to say that individuals probably were still drinking, even though it wasn't allowed to be sold.
Right.
I obviously can't say that for sure. But it was officially the last that I know of, at least the last municipality in Wisconsin to still be dry. But it's not anymore. You can get beer and wine here.
So
Just
my
not hard
question, it's good to know. I mean, right. I'm sure there's a lot of carry-ins, but
Bring your own bottle.
my question is we had those pictures of those ships, and Schlitz had their ships and whatever. And my guess is they brought their own. Is that what the expectation was at that point?
Yeah, I mean, it's not unlikely that those individuals probably just had their own alcohol with them. I mean, you have to remember too, like Ephraim is, surrounded by other places too. Like even though Ephraim was a dry place, Sister Bay is very shortly north of us, and Fish Creek is very shortly south of us. And to my knowledge, neither of those municipalities were dry. So someone, I think, and that's part of why the dry stayed in Ephraim, because that was an appeal for a lot of people. People kind of liked that this was a place that, places were closed at 8. It was quiet. You didn't have to worry about bar crowds. It wasn't a place that you had drunken rowdiness. If you wanted that, you could go to the towns over, but here it was quiet. You didn't have to worry about that. And this was a place to relax. And I think that was the appeal. And now that's changed a little bit. From what I've seen, there's really been no rowdiness, but that was the appeal, I believe.
We'll do a presentation at some point with those folks up in Sister Bay, and we'll find out their side of the story.
Yeah, right. There you go. What happened? Yeah.
Funny. Well, gentlemen, wonderful presentation. It's fun to try to connect two places like this that are juxtaposed yet have so much in common as far as why they exist in the first place. So Cody Schreck from the Ephraim Historical Foundation and Steve Schaffer, the Assistant Archivist at the Milwaukee County Historical Society. Thank you both for your time putting this together. And I want to remind everybody, next week for the MCHS presentation is Antiques Virtual Show with Hindeman Auctions. So get ready for that. And that's next Thursday at 7:30. Same place, same time, stuff like that. So everybody stay safe. We'll go up to Ephraim and do shots.
You can try. I don't know if it'll work.
Your yacht, John? Are we taking your yacht?
Oh, my yacht. Yeah, that's right. My yacht's a kayak, so it's weird. We'll squeeze into it. All right, everybody, take care, and we'll see y'all again soon. See ya.